Wow. I just sat here pondering that the first console generation is 50 years old. And there's only 9 of them. Step it up. The first generation is something that next to nobody talks about. And for good reason. I mean, like half of the consoles just play Pong. It's a dog shit generation. Who wants to play Pong with just one console when I can have a console that plays so many games? Modern hits, modern classics like... No. Who wants to play Pong? Yeah, I want a console that does this and this only. The very first generation of game consoles is what I refer to as the Pong console generation because that's exactly what like 90% of these consoles were. Most of them had one game built in, and that was Pong. Most allowed you to play different variations, but at the end of the day, it was still just Pong. These consoles were sold between 1972 to 1983. Something you notice is that there's quite the overlap between generations, especially in the early days. Even though by 1983 these consoles were dead and done, that's still the same year the Famicom came out in Japan, which became the NES 2 years later. And even when the NES came out, Atari released a new version of their second-gen 2600. The first year of the generation, 1972, may as well be one of the most influential years in video game history. In June, 2 guys named Nolan Bushnell and Ted Dabney founded the company called Atari. Then, in September, the Magnavox Odyssey released, which was the first ever video game system sold in stores. These two are closely related, as when Bushnell saw a demonstration for the Odyssey in May of that year, it inspired him to create Atari's first and arguably most successful game, Pong. The game he saw was the table tennis game, one of the titles for the Odyssey. This system is notable for having the best commercial music, or being the first console ever, but come on, recorder music in a commercial, it doesn't get much better than this.
To create a closed-circuit electronic playground, Odyssey gives you all the exciting action of hockey.
God, this fucking instrument makes me want to buy a Magnavox Odyssey. The Odyssey was incredibly primitive, created by Ralph Baer based on his black box prototype in 1967, later licensed to Magnavox. The Odyssey was only capable of displaying 3 squares and a vertical line, and the Odyssey, among other consoles in the early first gen, required players to put in their scores manually. Telling the other player to look behind them and then changing the score without them looking is the original cheat device. What did the Odyssey do in place of graphics? Plastic overlays. The console came shipped with these plastic overlays to put over the screen. Every game came with an overlay that represented what you're even supposed to do here. Some games even have cards or board game paraphernalia. All of the games came on cartridges, but these were just for show really. All of the games were already on the system, the cards were just a way to select the games. Later Pong consoles just used switches. The Odyssey that we know had basically zero competition. All other consoles in the generation came out after it was discontinued in 1975. For example, the Odyssey. That came out the same year. In 1974, the company Philips, which is a name you might recognize if you watched me talk about failed game consoles a few months ago, bought Magnavox and released the Odyssey series of consoles, which were more in line with other Pong consoles of the generation. This series had the Odyssey 100 through 4000. Yeah, hey Magnavox, where's the Odyssey 3, 4, 5, 6? Wait a fucking second, they made that many? There's only 9 consoles in the series, the names are incredibly misleading. They made that many? The Odyssey 100 had 2 games, tennis and hockey. It was a little more advanced than the normal Odyssey because the 100 actually had sound. It was incredibly crude and you still had to keep track of your own score, but we're getting somewhere. The Odyssey 200 had a new game, Squash, and was the first console to have the option for 4-hole paddles on the screen. The 300 was more advanced with an actual scoring system, the same 3 games, and was made directly to compete with the Coleco Telstar, which we will get to later. They also removed the ability to move the paddle horizontally, which, yes, I was at the protest before you ask. The 400 was just an updated version of the 200, was the first to have on-screen scoring, and added back the horizontal control. It was a violent protest. The 500 had color graphics and used actual sprites which were players of the game that you chose. Then we jump all the way to 4305, which is just a 500 built into a TV. These are incredibly rare. Back down to the 2000, this is just an upgraded 300, which means horizontal control is gone once again. No! The 3000 looks fucking cool. It looks like my grandpa's washing machine if you painted it black. Still looks clean as hell, especially for Pong consoles at the time. The final one, the 4000, added 3 whole games: soccer, basketball, and grid ball, adding up to a total of 6 games you can play on this thing. A perfect swan song to the Odyssey line, ending in 1977. While the original Odyssey sold 350,000 units, the Odyssey series sales are unknown. In Europe, Philips had their quote-unquote own Odyssey consoles, though these only slightly different from their American counterparts. The most differences are cosmetic. The other big line, at least here in America, was the Coleco Telstar line of systems, which started in 1976 and ended in 1978. There were 14 models in this line. Holy shit! I'll just go over the more notable ones, i.e. the one Wikipedia has listed. The original Telstar was this wood grain beast that had 3 Pong variants: hockey, handball, and tennis. The Telstar Classic is the same thing as the normal Telstar, but looks way sleeker. I don't know if you can call something classic if it's less than a year old, though. I mean, but like, what can I say? My newborn son's finally warming up to the family. He's a classic. The Telstar Deluxe, aka the Video World of Sports, was made specifically for the French-Canadian market, including options for both French and English text. The Ranger came with a new ball game, Jai-Alai, but the main edition was the Gun. It came with 2 new games for the Gun, Target and Skeet. You can tell this thing was made in the 70s with how actual gun-like the gun looks. I mean, god, if I had this thing, I probably would have accidentally shot my TV by now. The Alpha got rid of the gun and the games that came with it, but in its place is Squash. Thanks. The Colormatic replaces Squash with Jai-Alai, and every game has color graphics, but if you were feeling monochromatic that day, then the region has you covered since it's the same thing but without the color. The Sportsman brings back the Gun, but outside of that, little is known about this thing. The Colortron is the Colormatic with sound, the Combat is a console based on Atari's Tank, the Marksman brings back the Gun and is in color, the Galaxy has 48 entire games. I know what I'm taking to a deserted island. The Gemini had 4 pinball games and 2 gun games, exactly what I needed. Then the last Telstar, the arcade, was quite different, having a paddle control, a steering wheel, and a gun. Yeah, nothing new, my car in real life has this. This system had cartridges, which I guess were kinda similar to the Magnavox Odyssey, but they looked more official, and although there were only 4 carts released, each cart came with different games. The sales numbers of this line is around 1 million. Not too bad, but there was also 14 systems in this line, so that really bumped shit up. So far, things are heating up. Telstar brought some tough competition with all the variations and new ways to play. So let's just see how it compares to the Audiosonic PP420. At least it has a funny name. Most of the consoles in this gen are dime a dozen. A lot are cheap consoles for quick Pong fun, but in 1975, Atari wanted to get into the home action as well. The Home Pong was released just 2 years before the 2600 and is the winner of the Most Truthful Name Award of 1975, as it's literally just Pong at home. It doesn't come with squash, Jai-Alai, hockey, handball, none of that. It's just Pong. I mean, to be fair, at that time it was the most official way to play Pong at home because it was by the company that literally made the game. A few months before, the company Epic released the first home console in Japan, the TV Tennis Electro Tennis. This console was just your average Pong console, but it hooked up to the TV wirelessly using an ultra-high frequency antenna. That's a point for this console because none of my consoles do that. This thing wasn't that much of a success depending on what number you trust on Wikipedia. It either sold 10,000 or 20,000 units. Wikipedia also says 3 million, but that's the most incredible jump in numbers of all time, so I highly doubt it. The final line of first-gen consoles was also in Japan, the Color TV game Series, and if you already know who made it, don't ruin the surprise for your aunt who may or may not be watching behind you. There was once a company that made toys and playing cards, but went into the video game industry with these systems due to a multitude of reasons, particularly the explosion of Space Invaders' popularity and an oil crisis making toys hard to make. This company was none other than Nintendo. Now your aunt's in complete shock. They released their first home console on June 1st, 1977, the Color TV Game 6, featuring 6 entire variations of Pong. It was way cheaper than other competing Pong consoles, but for a more deluxe experience, literally a week later, Nintendo released the Color TV Game 15, which has 15 playable games, go figure. Actually, the 6 also has 15 games, but the other 9 are inaccessible under normal circumstances. The Color TV Racing 112 is a console with variations of the same racing game, and it even has a detachable wheel. It's like I'm really there. All of the variations add up to 112 possible games to play. I think I know what I'm bringing to a really deserted island. The Color TV Block Kazushi was a console that played Breakout, which at the time was only in America, and Nintendo released a version of the game in Japanese arcades called Block Fever. The outside of this console was one of the very first video game projects by Shigeru Miyamoto, who joined the company in 1977. The final color TV system was the Computer TV Game, a version of their game Computer Othello for homes, and by a version, I mean that the game is literally the arcade board that you plug into your TV. This thing didn't sell well due to the waning interest of dedicated consoles around this time. When the Color TV Game 6 came out, it was the same year the Atari 2600 came out in America, so it was already becoming an outdated technology. All the other ones sold pretty well though. Both Color TV games sold 1 million, and the Color TV Racing and Block Kazushi sold 500,000 each, which adds up to 3 million sold. It's pretty cool that Nintendo's first success in the game industry was in the very first generation of consoles. In terms of handhelds this generation, there was Mattel Auto Race, so if you're a fan of that, then this is your moment. The winner of this generation is our favorite N/A. I mean, let's be real here, there was next to no competition in the console business this generation. What even was there to say?
My console can play Pong better than your console! Oh yeah? Up your nose with the rubber hose, buddy!
While the Color TV game series sold the most, it wasn't really competing against anything, and the competition here in America was barely there. Things didn't start picking up until the second generation with consoles like the Atari 2600 and the ColecoVision. That's when things become interesting. The generation ended with a lack of interest in dedicated consoles, as well as plenty manufacturers leaving due to a market decline in 1977. The market was just way too oversaturated. There were hundreds of consoles that just played the same games as the more successful ones. Why would you get the Allied name of the game when you have multiple other consoles that serve the same purpose it does? At least it comes with a light gun. Oh my god, that's just a straight up handgun. This console is awesome now. The dedicated console market did actually see a resurgence in the 2000s with those plug-and-play TV consoles based on children's characters, but that was really kinda just a fad. The Fairchild Channel F started the beginning of the end in 1976, being the first second-gen console. It was also the first to have a microprocessor and actual cartridges. But that gen is another story for a different day. The first gen is a very undertalked generation. I mean, all the other generations get so much talk, but the first gen just doesn't really have anything going on. I mean, none of those Pong consoles can play open season on UMD video. I need a console to watch that damn bear shake his fucking ass at the gas station, baby! I just got diagnosed with memory loss. Now, the doctor said it resets about every 14 minutes or so in case I forget, I wrote the topic that I wanted to talk about today on my arm. So, second gen consoles it is today. First generation of consoles. Boom. Done. They did that already. Wanna know what they did next? They made the second generation of consoles. What? This gen had hits like Pong and Donkey Kong. The second generation lived from 1976 all the way to 1992. We're still experiencing that crazy overlap between generations, though there weren't any new consoles released during the third generation, simply just companies refusing to discontinue their consoles. With the first and the second, that damn Nintendo kept releasing first geners all the way until 1980. A lot of the games you'd see in this generation are arcade ports, primarily because the second gen was going on alongside the golden age of arcades. Titles like Pac-Man, Donkey Kong, and Space Invaders were gobbling quarters, while games like Bubbles, I mean, it's Bubbles. Many of the same companies from last time returned. Atari, Coleco, and Magnavox all had stuff, Coleco and Magnavox having significantly less hats in the ring. Where Coleco had 14 last gen, they have 2 now. Newcomers arrived such as Fairchild and Mattel, who both had 1 console, and Atari came back with 2. One was a very popular console and defined the second generation, and the other one was really dog shit. Let's start all the way at the beginning with the Fairchild Channel app. Fuck is this, the news? Initially released as the Fairchild Video Entertainment System, they realized that name can never sell a console and surely won't go far, but especially when Atari released their video computer system a year later, they changed the name to the Channel F. The F means fun. I thought it meant fucking stupid. This was the very first console to use a microprocessor and to use ROM cartridges instead of having games built into the console. This changed everything. Instead of a few versions of Pong being included with the console and those being the only games to play, the ROM cartridges of the Channel F allowed for basically any game that can run on it to run on it. The Channel F only had 27 carts released for it, and none of these games were much of a system seller. The Channel F sold only around 350,000 units because once Atari came out with their video computer system, the Channel F was basically toast. In 1977, the Atari 2600 released, although it wouldn't be dubbed that until 1982. Many people just call this the Atari since it's the most popular Atari console by a mile. Atari thought that the monopoly tactic was the best way to go this generation, acquiring the rights to many popular arcade ports so that other consoles couldn't have them. They all told the other consoles, you can't play Pac-Man, followed by the most salt in the wound Nana Nana Boo Boo, which basically ensured Atari's success in this generation. That doesn't mean they were good console ports, like here's the original Pac-Man, and here's Pac-Man on the 2600. But also, Atari had plenty of their own popular arcade games that can only be on their own systems, such as Asteroids, Breakout, Centipede, and even Steeplechase. Maybe not Steeplechase. The system's first killer app wouldn't actually come until 1980 with the release of Space Invaders for the console, which was already a huge game in arcades. The success of the 2600 led to things like competition from Coleco and Mattel, the start of many third-party developers like Activision. Oh god. Mattel's Intellivision wouldn't be released until 1980, but guess who came back in 1978? Magnavox released the Odyssey 2 in 1978. This isn't the Odyssey series, the 2 is its own damn thing. Unlike any of the other systems, or unlike any system in general, the Odyssey 2 had a whole damn keyboard right on the console for educational titles, selecting options, or programming. If Casey's Crazy Chase or Pickaxe Pete aren't your thing, f*** you, make your own damn game. Oh, that's Magnavox's words, not mine. Most of the games by Magnavox had exclamation marks in the titles. I personally don't get that excited for Turtles, but I will get excited for Nimble Numbers Ned. I'm a bitch for alliteration. There were some arcade ports on the system, such as Frogger, Q*bert, and Popeye, though third-party titles were few and far between. Like, the first third-party game on this system came out in 1983. The Odyssey 2 didn't do that bad here in America, but it did way better in Brazil, where it was released as the Philips Odyssey, since they didn't get the first one over there. Also, the Odyssey had region locking, but only for specific titles, so if you were itching to play Frogger in Europe or Chess in America, sorry. Oh, thank I can play Frogger. Mattel released the Intellivision in 1980, being their first game console. They had their line of handhelds in the first gen, but those are less video games, more so toys. While not Atari's first competition, the Intellivision was the first console to actually pose a threat to the 2600, mainly because there was a big ace up Mattel's sleeve: advertising. They made a series of commercials that had the Intellivision and the 2600 running side by side, showcasing the superior graphics of the Intellivision. These ads wanted you to look at the 2600 like, I don't want that wimpy Atari, this one plays golf better. Atari also had ads, and a lot of them asked one simple question. Have you played Atari today? God, Atari, I surely won't remember with all this memory loss going on around here. They wanted the Intellivision to be a more mature console, so they didn't market it as a toy. Games such as Sea Battle or B-17 Bomber weren't designed as pick-up-and-play arcade games, and reading the instruction manual for some games was almost a prerequisite. The Intellivision had a ton of third-party support, like Sega made games for it, Parker Brothers made games for it, even Atari and Activision made games for it. Coleco would also make games for the Intellivision, though this was before the ColecoVision came out. There were also console add-ons for this thing. The IntelliVoice gave the console speech synthesis abilities, and the controller, Jesus the Intellivision started the most disgusting trend in controller design, having a whole damn number pad on the controller. Like a phone. I'm feeling a little observational today, if you couldn't tell. This design didn't really leave this generation except for Atari, who decided let's get despicable when creating the Jaguar controller. The people responded, 150,000 units. The Intellivision was only the first of two consoles Mattel made, the other one being the Hyperscan, which was an incredibly horrendous console. And next we have Coleco. In 1982, they created the ColecoVision. It was another console that rivaled Atari pretty good. So much so that they made an add-on that lets you play 2600 games on the ColecoVision. Atari responded, that's cute, I hope you like the law. They also released a straight-up clone console that played 2600 games while the 2600 was being sold. Coleco was competing with Atari by using their own invention. Imagine for a second that Sony made their own Wii. Okay, you got me there. Coleco had more ports of the hidden gems of the arcade. The console launched with Sega Zaxxon, and they were even able to develop Donkey Kong for the system and include it as a pack-in title, which was agreed upon in a meeting with Hiroshi Yamauchi himself before Donkey Kong even released in America. This console was way more powerful than the Atari 2600, having closer arcade conversions than its counterparts. The ColecoVision even influenced the creation of Nintendo's Famicom, which is crazy for a console that didn't do all too well in the grand scheme of things, especially compared to its other counterparts. The Vectrex was an interesting console that utilized vector graphics. The games were all in black and white, but it had its own screen, so it didn't need to be plugged into a TV. The games for this title all came with color overlays for the screen to make up for the limitations, a la the Magnavox Odyssey. A game kinda like Asteroids came built into the system. The last console in this generation was another Atari joint. The Atari 5200 was released in November of 1982, 2 and was just bad. Trying to ride the success wave of the 2600, the 5200, while it touted better graphics, the games on this console just felt like updated 2600 titles. It didn't help that the 5200 had no backwards compatibility, so it wasn't like you could play your old 2600 games. It also didn't help that around this time, Mattel released an add-on to their Intellivision redesign that let you play 2600 titles. The pack-in title, Super Breakout, was criticized for not doing much to showcase the advantages of the 5200. While the console was technically similar to the ColecoVision, that had a more authentic version of Donkey Kong packed in. The controllers were just really bad too. They used the phone pad and the joystick wasn't precise at all. While the 2600 would go on and not be discontinued until 1992, the 5200 got discontinued in just under 2 years. However, the 5200, Vectrex, and even ColecoVision fell victim to one of the greatest tragedies in all of gaming. In 1983, the video game market crashed. Uh-oh. A recession hit the industry so bad, consumers lost interest in video games, calling them a fad, and many prominent manufacturers in this generation straight up dipped. In 1983, the video game industry was worth about $3.2 billion. In just 2 years, it was worth $100 million. There were a few main factors for this. First of all, the console market became flooded. Not only did every one of these consoles have almost the same games, some are just different versions. I have mentioned some before, but the Sears Telegames console, that's just the Atari 2600. Same for the Coleco Gemini. The Intellivision 2 was just a redesigned Intellivision despite the name. Hubert released on 9 different consoles and every version was the exact same. The market was just not viable for competition and Atari was winning solely on brand recognition. Companies were using a pricing scheme called it, where they were selling consoles at a loss just to get more competitive. Then every company started releasing bad games just to get them out. The poster child of this is Atari's own E.T., which some deem to be the worst game ever. Like really, I played Big Rigs a couple of weeks ago, at least E.T. was somewhat of a finished product. But E.T. was a really hyped game. It was the licensed game based on the highest grossing movie of 1982. It had high standards to live up to and failed to meet them all. They had only 6 weeks to do the entire game from the start of development to putting the game out in stores just to meet a holiday deadline. Everyone hated it. Famously, millions of unsold copies were buried in a New Mexico landfill. Been there, done that. I lived ET 2600's life. Pac-Man on the 2600 was an extremely botched port of the game with massive sprite flickering and just being completely incomparable to the arcade version. And when I say every company, I mean every company. Quaker Oats and Purina dog food were making Atari games. Console manufacturers were making games for each other's consoles. This wasn't a war. This was a friendly argument over brunch. Coleco didn't just have the rights to develop Donkey Kong for the ColecoVision, they had the rights to make every console port at the time, so they deliberately made the other ports inferior. The Atari 2600 has you play as my uncle trying to save Maggie Simpson from an evil gingerbread man. And the Intellivision version? What? Atari gave way too much freedom to third-party developers with next to no quality control. Even Atari themselves had no quality control. Many games were coming out with major bugs that went unchecked. Some games would even crash the system. We as gamers complain about games coming out unfinished nowadays, but imagine that unfinished buggy mess being the final version of the game. Atari owners in 1982 didn't have to. Marketing for these games were downright deceptive, making customers feel cheated out. Anyone, and I mean anyone, can make a game for Atari and sell it in stores. There were so many games for the 2600 that could be summed up in one word: shovelware. That's not to say that other consoles didn't have shovelware, but Atari had it bad. There was even a lot of porn games being sold next to regular ones. Custer's Revenge was being sold right next to Cookie Monster Munch, which, if you're watching, you've been tricked into watching my new game show, porn title or not. Then the competition from home computers made people go, why buy this that only plays video games? Home computers could play the games you know and love on top of Microsoft Excel. This thing is great, why would anybody play on these stupid things? By 1983, the cost of a home computer was about the same as a console anyway, and while games on there didn't perform all too well, who cared? Computers could do so much more. Computers like the Commodore 64 and the Apple II were on par with second-gen consoles graphically anyway. The crash killed Atari's credibility and basically killed the original Atari, who by now were just keeping the 2600 alive. Despite the ColecoVision being pretty solid, the crash, among other factors, made Coleco drop out of the video game industry in 1985, and they focused on toys until going defunct in 1989. Mattel is still around, but that's because they're a multi-billion-dollar toy company. They're fine, though they did release that thing in 2006. The Vectrex just didn't stand a chance. Milton Bradley lost about $30 million in that one. Now, the crash was pretty much localized entirely in America. The third gen started in 1983 over Eastern Japan, and over there, they call the crash the Atari Shock. Home consoles weren't the only consoles around this generation. There was the Microvision, the first handheld to support swappable cartridges, except all the cartridges were basically their own console. You popped into this sucker. It was discontinued because this thing was prone to damage from static electricity, and the LCD screen was prone to rot. The Palmtech Supermicro isn't a eulogy for my penis, but it is a very unsuccessful console. Had only 3 games, broke easily, and sold less than 40,000 units. However, the most popular handheld line from this generation was the Game & Watch series of systems made by Nintendo. The first one they made was Ball in 1980, and the last one they made was The Legend of Zelda in 2021. The Donkey Kong system was the very first appearance of the D-pad, and the system itself kinda looks like a DS. Can't be too sure though, we'll have to check in with my Is It a Nintendo DS consultants. The line was discontinued in 1991, probably because the Game Boy was the thing at the time. This also cemented Nintendo's success in the handheld market, as the Game & Watch was the best-selling thing this generation. The winner of the second generation was the Atari 2600, and even though Coleco and Mattel provided strong competition, both of them trailed behind the 2600. The Atari 2600 would carry the second gen before being discontinued in 1992, marking the end of the second generation. It lived through the third generation by positioning itself as a budget alternative to the NES. The gen lives on today in the form of those mini consoles, replicas of the real deal with a bunch of games slapped on it. The company At Games produces the Atari Flashback, ColecoVision Flashback, and the Intellivision Flashback. In my personal opinion, I think At Games should invest in a thesaurus. However, in 1983, Nintendo released the Famicom in Japan, and 2 years later released it stateside as the Nintendo Entertainment System. They copied Fairchild, those bastards! And... oh shit, what was I talking about again? Oh, okay. And... shit, what was I talking about again? I'm starting a new beginning in my life. After a deep reflection on myself, I decided to take the next big step and localize to Christianity. And for all you Jesus heads out there, I finally did it. I found a console that was created in God's image. Wholesome, right? Oh, God! Would be anyone's reaction after hearing the absolute travesty that was the game crash in 1983. The game industry was in shambles. Nobody cared about video games anymore, and it's all because of 3 reasons. Too many consoles, no quality control, and the rise of home computers. I'm not gonna go too in-depth about the crash. That's mainly a second-gen thing, and hey, guess what I talked about last year? But what if I told you the same year the crash happened was when the third generation started in Japan? I didn't ask. The family computer from Nintendo and the SG-1000 from Sega were released on the same day in the relatively small Japanese console market. Due to the size of the market there, or lack thereof, a crash never really happened in Japan. The crash was localized almost entirely in the United States. Or did it? Because maybe the real crash in 1983 was the friends we made along the way. The Atari 2600 didn't release in Japan until 1983, after both Nintendo and Sega's consoles came out. They just simply didn't have the same issues that we had over here. It took a couple years for America to get the third gen started, but once it did, oh man, there was nothing like it. Starting off right at the beginning, Nintendo's family computer, aka the Famicom, marked the beginning of something alright. The Color TV game series of consoles wasn't lighting the world on fire. It was only released in Japan after all, and even then it wasn't the most popular thing out there. Sure, it was the best-selling series of consoles in the first generation, but this was a little bit before Nintendo decided to go all in with video games. Many people probably expected the Famicom to be an instant success, but believe it or not, it wasn't. Early models had a bad chipset, which caused early models of the Famicom to crash. So the crash really did happen over there. Nintendo had to recall the Famicom, give it a new motherboard, and after that, the Famicom still took a bit to gain traction. Now let's talk about the console itself. This controller layout is one of the most iconic things out there. The classic D-pad and 2-button combo almost didn't happen. In place of the D-pad, Nintendo was about to put joysticks on the controllers until someone slapped a Game & Watch D-pad on a prototype controller, and they found it to be way more comfortable than the joystick. Also, the second controller has a microphone. Why? I don't know, probably for shits and giggles. But for the first 2 years, the Famicom struggled to sell much. It was doing better than the competitors, sure, but it took a fucking plumber for the Famicom to become the behemoth it eventually became. Super Mario Bros. Released in 1985 and propelled the Famicom to success. Because of that game alone, Nintendo sold 4 million units in 1985. It was the one game you had to play. You could either get a Famicom and play the must-have title in 1985, or you can reject society and go play Flicky. Yeah, I sure wonder which console was more successful. The one that can play Pachinko too! It's better than Pachinko. It has a 2 at the end. Despite the two consoles coming out on the exact same day, the Sega SG-1000 was made in response to the Famicom. Honestly, it only made sense for Sega to start making home consoles. Not only have they made games for other systems, but by the early 80s, they were incredibly popular at arcades. Their success in the video game industry and Nintendo's upcoming Famicom led to Sega releasing the SG-1000, which stands for the Sega Game 1000. That explains a lot. The whole time I thought it meant Sega Gega. If you take a hard look at the name, it is a little weird. Sega already stands for Service Games, so the legal name of the SG-1000 is the Service Games Game 1000. We're experiencing first-generation disease here. The SG-1000 released alongside Sega's home computer, the SC-3000. I'm pretty sure it's self-evident what that C stands for. Crotch! The SG-1000 was only released by Sega themselves in Japan. However, it did have official releases in Australia and New Zealand. Unofficially, there was the Telegames Personal Arcade, which was a clone released in Taiwan, and interestingly enough, the United States, which this clone was able to play both SG-1000 and ColecoVision titles. The SG-1000 sold triple Sega's expectations by the end of 1983, partly due to the fact that by this time, the SG had 21 games available and the Famicom only had 9, as well as the Famicom Recall being a thing. However, the Famicom still remained the more popular choice because Nintendo had the more recognizable titles. While Nintendo only had 3 launch titles for the Famicom, these games were Donkey Kong, Donkey Kong Jr., and Popeye. It's a bit hard to find what games the SG launched with. Some sites say that the console had a handful of games released for it, others say it had a single game, which was Borderline. Which, yeah, if that's your only competition against Donkey Kong, I don't think you stand a chance. I think another game was Starjacker. Like, come on, Sega, that's what I do on Reddit on a nightly basis. However, despite falling in Nintendo's shadow, the SG-1000 did sell more than the other contemporaries. By 1984, the Famicom started to outpace the SG-1000. It was cheaper, was more powerful, and Nintendo was making deals with third parties left and right, ultimately giving them a way bigger library. Sega didn't want their arcade competitors to be releasing games for the SG-1000 because they didn't want to lose sales from software. By the end of its life, the SG-1000 only had 71 games in total, 29 of which required the Sega Card Catcher add-on, as those games were on Sega cards and couldn't be played on the SG-1000 without them. Compare that to the 1,260 games you can play on the Famicom, and although 200 of those were for the Famicom Disk System add-on, that's still over 1,000 games you can play on just the base Famicom. That didn't stop Sega from releasing a redesign of the SG-1000 on July 31st that same year, which was called the SG-2000, right? Right? The Sega SG-1000II, aka the Mark II, was an update of the original SG-1000. The biggest changes are obviously the design itself, but the controllers got updated as well to look more like the Famicom controller. You see, the original controller was begging for a redesign. It looks like it'd snap if I just hurt its feelings. Plus, the Mark II had a second controller port. Now you and a buddy can play, Hustle Chummy. Yeah, the Mark II didn't do so great. Many people saw it as nothing more than a redesign. If you didn't already have the Mark I, sure, get the 2, but you didn't really need one if you had the other. This design was almost only released in Japan, but Sega looked at Taiwan with their bootleg Mark I and said, sure, here you go. Over a year after the Mark II being a thing, Sega made the next logical step and decided to release the Mark III. Yes, on October 20th, 1985, Sega pushed out the Mark III into the Japanese market, but unlike the Mark II, the 3 was basically a new console. It looks incredibly similar to the Mark II, straight up to the point where an untrained eye could mistake the two systems. But don't be fooled, the Mark III is a beast of its own. While a lot of aspects of the Mark III are the same as the SG-1000, the biggest upgrade is with the graphics. The SG-1000 fell way behind the Famicom graphically, however the Mark III was actually better than the Famicom. A card slot was added in front of the cartridge slot that let players use Sega cards. No, these don't store money, but they were a very cost-effective way to store games. For a full 8 months, despite this thing having a cartridge slot, not a single cartridge was produced for the Mark III. However, the game Fantasy Zone made Sega start producing carts again. During those 8 months though, if you were really needing to use that cartridge slot, well, the Mark III was backwards compatible with all the SG-1000 titles. Though the Mark III barely put a dent in Nintendo's install base. While Sega stayed strong, the Mark III only sold over 1.7 million units. In Japan. You may say, are you out of your mind? The Mark III didn't make it out of Japan. You're technically not wrong. You see, if you live in the red outline on this map, you did actually get the Mark III. Yeah, look through every console released in America, you're not gonna see a Sega Mark III anywhere, but you will see the Master System. Yes, the Sega Master System was the international title of the Mark III, and this thing sold 10 to 13 million units. Sega in 1986 established Sega of America, and later that year released the Master System nationwide. By the end of the year, Sega came in second place. In third was Atari at 100K, first was Nintendo at 1.1 million, and Sega, Christ, Sega, at least they outsold Atari, but ever since the 5200 came out, beating Atari wasn't much of a feat, and it's not like they outsold them by much. The Master System didn't do terrible in America, but it fell flat on its face compared to Nintendo, and in 1987, the Mark III re-released as the Master System in Japan. Give up, Sega. Most of the Master System's success wasn't in either Japan or America, but this thing did numbers in Europe and Brazil. You see, Europe was easy. Nintendo actually failed to make much of an impression over there. While the NES was released in PAL territories, it's not like much was done to make people consider one over home computers like the Commodore 64 and the ZX Spectrum. Sega had the bright idea to market the Master System as an alternative to those two. And it worked. By 1990, the Sega Master System was the best-selling console in Europe. Distributor Virgin Masteronic, do I need to put 2 on the innuendo board or is just 1 okay? Reported 150,000 Master Systems sold in 1990 alone. Compare that to Nintendo's 80,000. Even the Sega Mega Drive, which was the 4th-gen successor to the Master System, was only selling 60,000 units that year. In all of Europe that year, Sega sold 725,000 units, while Nintendo only sold 655,000. And the year after, a whopping 1,745,000 Master Systems were sold. But yeah, we can't mention the Master System without mentioning Brazil. It's the only way you can get me to mention them. Over there, the Master System was being distributed by the company Tectoy. Releasing in 1989, the Master System actually had a huge head start over Nintendo, who wouldn't enter the Brazilian console market until 1993 and didn't really compete much due to NES clones dominating the Brazilian market. In fact, the Master System was big enough in Brazil that there were 22 games exclusively released there, including a port of Street Fighter 2. Because where else would you play Street Fighter 2? I'm piss scared of playing it on something that isn't the Master System. Most of these games were nothing more than Game Gear ports, which the Game Gear is essentially just a portable Master System. Just like how Mickey's Ultimate Challenge was a Game Gear game, it was also the last game ever released on the Master System in 1998. However, if you didn't live in Brazil, your last Master System title was Sonic the Hedgehog in 1991. Now speak to any random Joe who knows anything about the Master System, and they'll tell you that the Master System is still being sold in Brazil. It is still sold over there, but it's not what you'd expect. They aren't producing the same old Master System from yesteryear and selling that. The Master Systems still sold in Brazil are consoles that come with 100 plus built-in titles. So to say that the Master System is still being sold in Brazil is to say that the Genesis is still being sold today through those at-games mini consoles, as it's basically the same thing. But Sega wasn't the first to make it overseas. Nintendo beat them by a year, sorta kinda. Yes, the NES was released in America in 1985, technically. On October 27th, 1985, the Nintendo Entertainment System was released exclusively in New York. Woo! Then finally, the NES was released in February of 1986. In Los Angeles. Then finally, the NES was released nationwide on September 27th, 1986. The NES was planned to come out earlier as the Nintendo Advanced Video Gaming System, which is a shuddering thing to think about. Imagine we were calling this thing the NAVS. Originally supposed to be a Nintendo and Atari joint, Atari got pretty pissed when they saw Coleco demonstrating the Coleco Atom home computer with Donkey Kong. The thing is, while Coleco had the rights for the console versions of Donkey Kong, Atari had the rights to the home computer versions, which led to Atari delaying their marketing contract with Nintendo, and when the at the time CEO of Atari, Ray Kassar, got fired, Nintendo was done tapping their foot and checking their watch, so they just decided to do it themselves. So they came up with a better name for the console, the Nintendo Advanced Video System. God damn it. This iteration of the NES was supposed to be a repackaged Famicom with a keyboard, a cassette data recorder, and wireless controllers. They were trying to copy off the Odyssey 2. Nintendo, ever since the beginning, has never made sense. Then yeah, after that, they picked up their shit and made the thing we all know and love today. Nintendo of America's approach to saving the video game industry in America was to say, video games? Never heard of her. This is a toy. And it entirely worked. Oh, the NES console? No, dude, that's the control DAC cartridges. Please, these are game packs. The system was originally packaged with peripherals like the NES Zapper and Rob the Robot to give the impression that this just wasn't a video game system. Though they didn't want to market it too much like a toy, like they redesigned the system entirely from the Famicom to avoid it looking like a child's toy, even if on a technical level, it's basically just a Famicom. Nintendo even wanted to avoid the poor quality control by releasing every game with the Nintendo seal of quality, which led to IGN calling this the best system of all time. And this is why we can't trust you, IGN. Yes, the NES saved the video game industry in America. Yes, the NES had some stellar titles, but for every Punch-Out, there's like 10 super pitfalls. The NES certainly had a better library than the Atari, but it also doesn't have the best library. Games like Super Mario 3, Kirby's Adventure, Mega Man 2, and Contra are absolutely stellar, but then again, you probably have the entirety of the LJN library. The NES is not a perfect console. That's not to say there's ever been a perfect console, but as someone who shares a release date with Madden 06, people who call the NES the best console ever are probably looking at the console with the rosiest, tintiest glasses ever. It was the best console of its time, though. I don't think we can just skim past that. Even when the Genesis came out in 1989, Nintendo releasing Super Mario Bros. 3 overseas in 1990 overshadowed the 16-bit Butte. Many prominent game series originated on this little thing. Super Mario, Zelda, Mega Man, Castlevania, Final Fantasy, and Dragon Quest, just to name a few. The industry truly wouldn't be the same without the NES. By the time the successor came out, 1 in 4 American homes had one, and almost 100% of homes with kids aged 8 to 15 had one. The NES not only saved the video game industry in America, but it also defined the third generation. The Nintendo Entertainment System was discontinued in 1995, and the Famicom was discontinued in 2003. This thing just didn't give up. Which is something that Atari should have done a long time ago. The Atari 7800 was released in this generation, and I think I said a while back that it was a successful console. Atari only had 2 consoles that did well. Obviously the 2600, but also the 7800. I'm also a fucking moron. Yeah, Atari's only success in the home console market was the 2600. The 7800 did beat the NES and the Master System to the nationwide market. Even if the NES was already out in the test regions of NY and LA when the 7800 released, it did release before the NES released nationwide and before the Master System even came out in America. Atari learned from the 5200 and included backwards compatibility with the 2600, which honestly didn't really matter because people were probably calling the 2600 that fucking thing by this point. While it could play the entirety of the 2600's library, it also had like 50 games to call its own. At the beginning of 1987, Atari reported that 100,000 7800 consoles had been sold. There were 1 million consoles sold by June of 1988. Who the fuck was buying this thing en masse? Well, the 7800 was just a drop in the bucket in the third gen of consoles, and hopefully, Atari would never make another home console ever again. Oh, fuck. The third generation of consoles was when consoles really started to become a staple in the living room. The NES being the most popular thing since sliced bread was truly something that Odyssey or 2600 couldn't have done. I mean, the NES had Super Mario Bros. The Odyssey just had f***ing numbers for games, and the 2600 had tax avoiders. Which, hey Atari, I play video games to escape reality, not to play it. It goes without saying that the NES/Famicom won this generation, both in America and Japan. It blew past all the other competition, and while Sega did have some redeeming qualities, it's not like they could have beat the NES. No way. While Sega actually did win over in Europe and Brazil, overall, yeah, Nintendo totally won this one. Not only did they popularize home consoles in Japan, but they also revitalized the industry over in America, while Atari sat in a corner and ate glue. It's not like Atari didn't put up a fight, but they also didn't try. In terms of other consoles, there were definitely more than just the 4 I talked about, but the MyVision, anybody? Or what about the VTech Socrates? Yup, we're getting philosophical on this one. There weren't any handhelds in the third gen, or handhelds worth mentioning at all. The Game & Watch series is still getting new titles, though that released in the second gen, and the Game Boy is primarily a 4th gen thing. It is really weird that I associate the Game Boy closely with the NES, even though it spent most of its life alongside the SNES. Like, there was a cartridge for the SNES that played Game Boy games. Stupid, stupid, stupid! The 4th generation of consoles started with the release of the PC Engine by NEC in 1987, which released in North America as the TurboGrafx 16 in 1988. At the end of it all, the 3rd generation lasted from 1983, and the last console to be discontinued discontinued was the Famicom in 2003, which is absolutely nuts that it was one of the consoles that started the entire generation. Nintendo would eventually end support in 2007 when they stopped repairing Famicoms due to a shortage of parts. And the church has ended support of me because I totally talked smack about the NES and praised the Master System, which is the system of the devil. I wonder if I could be forgiven at this point. God, please forgive me. I know you're up there, and I'm sorry for praising Sega.
If I were you, I'd just kill myself to get to hell quicker.
Thanks, God.